Welcome back to our Principles of Microeconomics video series. In recent videos, we focused on issues of externalities, public goods, and the role government plays in our economy. Now, we need to consider the issue of tax incidence, meaning who pays the cost of any tax that's imposed. We will then turn to another potential source of market failure, monopoly. Let's get to it. So in recent videos, we focused on the economic role of government, which mainly consisted of taxing and spending. But whenever a tax is imposed on a buyer or a seller of a good, its effect on equilibrium prices can be complicated. In particular, the effect of a tax will depend on both the demand and supply elasticity of the good, regardless of who's supposed to pay the tax. The way a tax affects the price consumers pay and the price sellers receive, net of any tax, is called the incidence of a tax. Let's look at an example. So suppose a market is in equilibrium at a price of $10 and a quantity of 50. Suppose that there's a tax of $2 imposed on consumers. Let's examine the effects of such a tax. First, because the tax is imposed on consumers, the tax shifts the demand curve to the left. Why is that? Well, given the original demand was 50 at a price of 10, then if there's a $2 tax, the market price, before paying the tax, would need to now be $8 to get consumers to still buy 50. A rational consumer doesn't really care who they have to pay to get the units of the good, paying $10 to the seller or $8 to the seller and $2 to the government in tax. It's really the same either way, from the consumer's point of view. But 50 units is not the equilibrium quantity now with the new tax. Instead, the supply curve and the new demand curve meet at a price lower than $10 and at a quantity lower than 50. The new quantity is 42 units and the price the seller receives is now $9.25. You just have to look at the supply curve to see that at a price of $9.25, the seller would only produce 42 units. But there's also a $2 tax. That means that while the producer receives $9.25, the consumer has to pay $11.25, the $9.25 to the seller plus the $2 tax. Notice that the $2 tax is shared. The producer now receives 75 cents less at the market equilibrium, and the consumer ultimately pays $1.25 more. Neither of them is paying $2 or receiving $2 less. Compared to the original equilibrium, the tax reduces consumer surplus. It's now just the triangular area below the demand curve and above the price, inclusive of tax, of $11.25. For producer surplus, it's now the triangular area above the supply curve and below the price the seller receives of $9.25. But that leaves some blank space that used to be part of our social surplus. The first blank space is a rectangle with a base of 42 and a height of $2. Well, that's just the tax revenue, $2 for each of 42 units, $84. The last remaining piece of the social surplus puzzle, compared to the original social surplus at the original market equilibrium, is the consumer and producer surplus from the 8 units that are no longer produced because of the tax. Before the tax, these were units of the good that the consumer and producer enjoyed, but now they are not produced because the tax makes it too expensive for the consumer. That is, we have an area of deadweight loss. To calculate the size of that deadweight loss, you just have to use the triangle formula. 1/2 times base times perpendicular height. In this case, it's 1/2 times the $2 tax and the base of 8, which, when you work it out, is $8. In the example we just looked at, the $2 tax was shared. The producer received 75 cents less at the new market equilibrium and the consumer paid $1.25 more. The amount of a tax paid by the buyer or the seller depends on how elastic demand and supply are. For goods that are inelastically demanded, the consumer will only buy a little less of the good when the tax is imposed, meaning that the producer will be able to sell almost as many as before and the consumer will just have to pay the higher price. In contrast, if demand elasticity is really high, the producer will have to pay the majority share of the tax, or else the consumer won't buy the good at all. What's most notable here is that it doesn't matter who the government imposes the tax upon. All that matters is the responsiveness of demand and supply to changes in the price they pay and receive for the good. Just to illustrate, on screen you can see 2 different demand curves, demand curve 1 and demand curve 2, where demand curve 1 has a higher elasticity because it has a shallower slope, along with the original supply curve and a supply curve where we've added a tax. Yes, in this case, the tax is imposed on the seller. If demand is D1, then the equilibrium without the tax is at the point labeled A, and with the tax is at point B. If demand is D2, the equilibrium without the tax is C, and with the tax is D. Without drawing lines or doing any fancy labeling of the areas, you should be able to just see that the price increase with the tax is largest when demand is D2, and the increase in price that consumers pay is relatively smaller when demand is D1. That is, when demand is inelastic, a tax will raise the price the consumer pays more than when demand is elastic. Okay, we're ready to move on from thinking about the issues of externalities, public goods, and government's role in our economy. The next way that we're going to consider how markets can fail to provide the socially optimal quantity of a good is a situation where there's not a lot of sellers of a good. Let's start with the most extreme example of that, where there's just one seller, a situation known as monopoly. To be specific, a monopoly producer is one who produces a good with no close substitutes, and where there are barriers to entry. Because they face no competition due to those barriers to entry, a monopoly producer has the power to set prices. They are price makers, not price takers. Because they can set prices higher than average total cost in the long run, monopoly producers will produce too few units of a good relative to the socially optimal quantity. Normally, we would expect that competition would fix the issues, but even if the monopoly producer is making large profits, nobody can enter the market and compete because of the assumption that there are these barriers to entry. In particular, we think of three types of real-world barriers to entry. The first is a natural barrier that arises from just the fixed cost of producing the good or from having access to some unique resource. Classic examples here include cable TV and internet companies and the De Beers Diamond Company, who owns most of the world's diamond mines. These kinds of firms are very profitable, and it's not easy to compete with them. For example, the enormous costs of setting up a cable TV company, laying cables in the ground and connecting all the houses to the network, and so on, before you can take in a penny in revenue, means that there are real and significant barriers to entry. Unsurprisingly, we tend to have to pay a lot for cable TV because in most areas of the United States, there's only one company providing that service. It just typically doesn't make economic sense for two companies to pay the fixed costs of setting up a network because they would have to share the customers. Indeed, both might make an economic loss in such a situation, leaving customers with no available TV or internet provider at all. The second type of barrier is entirely man-made. This includes things like patents that preclude competitors making a competing product and other legal restrictions on entry. A classic example here is EpiPen, a medication that's used in emergencies to treat serious allergic reactions to insect stings and bites, certain foods, drugs, and some other substances. For years now, the price of EpiPens has increased because nobody can legally produce a substitute that seems to work quite as well as the EpiPen product. The third type of barrier here is a network barrier. It's hard to compete with eBay, for example, because it already has a huge network of buyers and sellers who are just used to how eBay works, and they're familiar with it, and they stick with it. The monopoly producer problem is much the same as the competitive market producer problem. The monopoly firm still is going to produce where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and its profit is the difference between total revenue and total cost. But because the firm is the only producer of the good, they simply cannot sell their good at the prevailing market price like a competitive firm can. Instead, if they want to sell more, they're actually going to have to lower their price. That is, they face a real downward sloping demand curve. The problem is that they typically have to charge all of their consumers the same price for the good. So, if they want to sell more, they will have to lower the price for all consumers. But lowering the price creates two competing effects on the monopoly producer's revenue. One, the quantity effect. So they sell more of the good, they take in revenue. But on the other hand, there's a price effect. They sell the existing units at a lower price. Let's look at an example. So suppose a monopoly producer sells 3 units at a price of $6.50. To sell 4 units, it has to lower the price to $5.50. However, the increase in revenue is not simply $5.50. Instead, it is $2.50, consisting of a $5.50 increase from selling one more unit, called a quantity effect, and a $3 decrease in the revenue they receive for selling each of the 3 units that they used to sell for $6.50, but now sell for $1 less. Graphically, Area A here is the price effect. It has a base of 3 and a height of 1. Area B is the quantity effect. It has a base of 1 and a height of 550. The change in the monopoly producer's revenue is B minus A when lowering the price, and naturally it's A minus B if they were increasing their prices. For a monopoly producer, this means that the marginal revenue at each level of production is below the price measured by the demand curve. In the graph, we can see that at a quantity of 4, the marginal revenue is $2.50, the $5.50 quantity effect minus the $3 price effect. On screen, you'll see a familiar table of total costs, marginal costs, and average total cost that can help us solve the producer's problem. This table also includes prices and the associated marginal revenue for a monopoly producer. To keep things simple, the marginal cost here is just constant at $2.50. A rational firm will always produce where MC equals MR, marginal cost equals marginal revenue, so long as the price exceeds average total costs. At a quantity of 4, the marginal cost is $2.50 and marginal revenue is $2.50. At that output level, we would expect an equilibrium. And here, the price will be $5.50 because that's what the demand curve tells us, and average total cost is 3. So the firm is profitable and we truly have our equilibrium level of output for the monopoly producer. Graphically, we need the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the marginal cost curve to solve the producer's problem. We first look for where marginal cost equals marginal revenue on the graph. And in the graph, that's at a quantity of 4. Then we go to the demand curve and see that the market price has to be $5.50 for the quantity to be 4. If we then add average total cost to our graph, we can calculate the monopoly producer's profit. In particular, the graph says that at a quantity of 4, the average total cost is $3. That means profit is total revenue, 4 times the price of $5.50, minus costs, again the quantity of 4 times the average total cost of $3, which is $22 minus $12 for a profit of $10. In a competitive market, we would expect competitors to enter, prices to fall, and the producer's profit to decline. But because of barriers of entry, that just doesn't happen, and the monopoly producer makes a profit in the long run. You might be wondering where the supply curve is in the monopoly producer's problem. The answer is that it doesn't actually exist. A monopoly producer gets to choose their price. They don't just react to the market price. They are a price maker, like I said, not a price taker. Indeed, while the graph of the problem may seem a little complicated, the monopoly producer problem is in many ways simpler than the competitive market producer problem. Okay, that's enough for this video. We've examined tax incidence and introduced the concept of monopoly. In our next video, we will examine the effect of monopoly on consumer and producer surplus and try to figure out solutions to the monopoly producer problem. I'll see you in the next one.